Hi guys, it's Michelle and Merry Christmas. Today's video is going to be about some of the darkest true crime cases that took place around the holidays or on Christmas specifically. And this first case that we're going to be talking about is the case of Laci Peterson. And this is a super dark case that I think a lot of people think that they know the whole case and the whole truth behind it, but I feel like there is a lot of information that is missing out there. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the disappearance of Laci Peterson in 2002 in Modesto, California definitely shocked a lot of people. It was a very sad situation. A young, vibrant, pregnant woman who was 8 months pregnant vanished on Christmas Eve, leaving behind a heartbroken family and also a lot of questions, most of which are at the center of her husband Scott, which we will get into. Scott is currently in jail for the murder of Laci, but we're gonna eventually get there. But I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of this case, so we're gonna kind of go chronologically. So Laci was born on May 4th of 1974 in Modesto, California. She was described as a very all-American girl. She had a very bright, bubbly personality. She was a cheerleader in high school and often was just seen as a relatively happy girl. Scott was born on October 24th of 1972 in San Diego, California, and he had a similar well-off upbringing where he grew up in a comfortable environment. His parents did well, so him and his siblings grew up in a privileged environment. And Scott was an avid golfer and even received a golf scholarship to Arizona State University, though his partying and lack of focus ended up getting him kicked off the team. He eventually transferred to California Polytechnic State University, where he studied agriculture business. In December of 1994, Laci visited a friend who worked at a restaurant called Pacific Cafe, where Scott was also employed. The two hit it off immediately, and reportedly Laci made the first move by giving Scott her phone number. Their connection was super instant, and Laci quickly called her mother and told her that she had just met the one. Scott and Laci's relationship progressed very quickly. They were super inseparable and spent a lot of time together. They would visit Scott's parents' house for home-cooked meals, and Laci really bonded with Scott's mother over their shared love of gardening and Martha Stewart. And Scott's charm and attentiveness made him really seem like he was the perfect partner. He seemed very sweet and loving, and he had grand romantic gestures, the whole 9 yards. But ultimately, on August 9th of 1997, the two got married. After the two graduated from college, they moved to Modesto in 2000 and purchased a cute, charming bungalow with the financial help from Scott's parents. Laci worked as a substitute teacher, and Scott had become a fertilizer salesman, and they were honestly doing pretty well. Their life seemed very ideal with cute, fun family gatherings, gardening, plans for the future. They were just ultimately very happy. For years, Laci and Scott actually tried to conceive. They really wanted to have a baby, but after 3 years of trying, Laci was finally pregnant in mid-2002. The couple was eagerly excited and prepared for the arrival of their son, whom they planned to name Connor. Laci was decorating the nursery, she stayed active with yoga classes and would walk their dog, and just really wanted to stay active and healthy during her pregnancy. However, towards the end of her pregnancy and towards the end of her life, ultimately, she got very sick. Anytime that she would go for walks, she just would feel very overwhelmed and tired and like she was going to pass out. So the doctor kind of recommended that she take it easy. And she ended up quitting her job as a substitute teacher at that point. So everything seemed very beautiful and happy and perfect in this life of Scott and Laci. But unbeknownst to Laci, Scott was actually living a double life. Complete double life. So in November of 2002, Scott actually began an affair with a woman named Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno, California, whom he lied to, and she had no clue that he was married. According to Amber, he portrayed himself as a super devoted man ready to have a serious relationship, and she just absolutely fell for him. He was super charming and sweet, and she honestly would have never thought that what was to come would ever happen from this man. It's just two different people. So obviously she had no idea that he was married, but let alone that he had a pregnant wife at home. 8 months pregnant is she's about to pop. But ultimately, the disappearance occurred on Christmas Eve of 2002. So on the morning of December 24th, 2002, Scott and Laci were at their home in Modesto, and Scott claimed that Laci had planned to take the dog for a walk in the park, bake cookies, and go shopping for groceries because they were going to their family's home tomorrow for Christmas Day. Scott decided to go golfing that day, but this is where his story gets a little confusing and kind of shaky, is because he didn't actually go golfing, he went fishing. That's because he decided before he went golfing that it was too cold for him to golf, so he ended up going fishing instead. But this kind of later comes into play because he kind of said he was golfing and then he said, no wait, I wasn't golfing, I was fishing. It was kind of just confusing. But ultimately it was proven he was fishing that day. Neighbors reportedly saw Laci walking the dog that morning and also reportedly saw Scott loading patio umbrellas into his truck and leaving that morning. Scott returned home that evening and he noticed that the dog was in the yard and that Laci's car was in the driveway. So he kind of became concerned because he was like, why would she leave the dog outside? And the dog's leash was still attached. So he was just confused. He called Laci's mother, who immediately sensed that something was wrong. And then Sharon, Laci's mother, called the police, and that was when the search began. I would say pretty immediately, like as soon as the media had heard about this case, they kind of immediately started to point fingers at Scott. I think because his emotional behavior was very strange. He was acting very detached, unemotional. People thought it was odd that he had a fishing trip on Christmas Eve alone. Scott also initially told police that he went golfing that day and then only later admitted that he actually did go fishing. But when he was asked what he was fishing for or if he caught any fish, he couldn't really provide an answer about anything. And also Scott claimed that he had lied about where he was because he bought this boat. Even though they were kind of struggling financially at this point and trying to save money, he bought this boat without telling anyone, apparently. So months later, in April of 2003, on April 13th, the remains of a male fetus were found on the shore of the San Francisco Bay, and the following day, a female torso missing its head, arms, and legs were discovered nearby. So the dental records confirmed that the torso belonged to Laci, and the DNA testing identified the fetus as Connor. That was on April 13th. On April 18th of 2003, Scott was arrested in California near the Mexican border. He had dyed his hair blonde and was carrying camping gear, $15,000 cash, multiple credit cards, and his brother's passports. And authorities kind of believed that he was preparing to flee the country. Ultimately, this man had a trial on November 12th of 2004. He was convicted of first-degree murder for the murder of Laci and second-degree murder for Connor, and was sentenced to death by lethal injection, but that was actually overturned in 2020, and so he no longer has the death sentence on him, and some people think he's actually probably going to get a retrial at some point due to an unfair trial, because basically the media had really taken this case and ran with it, and the reason that people think that the trial was unfair is because the jury had access to what the media was saying about all of this, and this really just kind of made it for an unfair trial because the jurors were allowed to view all of the information of what people were saying about the case. Everyone was claiming pretty much that he was guilty, even though there was kind of a lack of evidence that he really did anything. So that's interesting. A lot of people do think he's guilty, and I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying I don't really see that the evidence is really that there. The fact that he was sentenced to death is kind of insane based on the lack of evidence here. It's like, it's not so clear cut. In fact, his alibi was actually pretty airtight. So we're going to go back and talk about kind of the events that unfolded on the day that Laci went missing, all the reports, and just essentially some theories as to what could have happened, why people think it was Scott, why people think it wasn't, and so on and so forth. So let's go back to the day Laci went missing. So as for Scott's alibi, in the morning, he claimed that he saw Laci at around 9:30 a.m. and she was eating cereal in the kitchen, planning her day, which included walking the dog, baking gingerbread cookies for Christmas, and shopping for Christmas Eve dinner. So at around 10 a.m., a neighbor saw Scott loading patio umbrellas into his truck. The neighbor waved to Scott, he waved back, and the observation supports his presence at home during this time. Scott arrived at his warehouse in Modesto at 10:30 a.m., where he logged into his work computer, sending an email and browsing the internet. And there are several digital timestamps that provide a very clear record of his activity during this period of time. And the prosecution really kind of threw away this as a sense of evidence, which is really frustrating because it's very clear that this man was like on his computer at very documented specific times, but he had like a 20-minute window where he wasn't on his computer. And the prosecution claimed that in those 20 minutes was when he put Laci's body in the river and that he had actually killed her the night before. But that doesn't make any sense because neighbors claim that they saw Laci on the morning of the 24th walking the dog. So again, I just think there's kind of a bit of confusion here. And it's not saying that it's impossible that he did it, but I just think that the prosecution really held on to things that didn't make much sense. And even though I think this guy is a piece of shit, because regardless, he was cheating on his wife and was a dick, but I don't think he really did actually have a fair trial. Because I think a lot of evidence that the defense supplied was actually kind of just ruled out. And the prosecution kept kind of changing their theories as to what happened. I don't know, it was kind of a mess. So Scott purchased his parking ticket at the Berkeley Marina at 12:54 p.m. and witnesses later reported seeing him with his boat at the marina. And the timestamp parking ticket also corroborates his claims of being at the marina that afternoon. Now, Scott went fishing, but he ended up leaving because it was too cold, and he returned to the marina and began to drive back to Modesto and was seen stopping for gas at 3:25 p.m. Scott arrived home at 4:30 p.m. where he saw their dog in the yard with her leash attached and Laci's car in the driveway. That's when he ended up calling Sharon, Laci's mother, and that was when Laci was reported missing. So there are a lot of critics of Scott's alibi, and they actually argue that it wasn't impossible for him to have committed the crime and still have adhered to this timeline. For example, they think that Scott could have killed Laci earlier in the morning and transported her body to the marina and returned home within the described time frame. But honestly, it doesn't quite make that much sense. And what's also really strange to me is the family at first did not think that Scott was involved in this whatsoever. Like, not his family, her family were like, there's no need for you to look at Scott. There's no way that he did anything. But once they found out about the affair, they were like, oh no, he killed her, which is fair because I think, like, you know, if you think, oh, this man would never have cheated on my daughter, and you think you know that character, but you find out that that's not true, then, you know, it's not that big of a, I mean, it is a big jump, but it's not that crazy that maybe he was not who he seemed. Obviously. There's just such a lack of evidence here. There was no blood or any forensic materials found in Scott's truck or his boat, which weakens the case against him. And also it was seen like to be basically impossible for him to have dumped her body over with the boat that he had because the boat would have just tipped. There was like all of this evidence that was just inadmissible in court, which again, is it because the media just wanted this case to be solved? I don't know. I'm not saying he's innocent, but I'm just saying I don't think that the way that the prosecution set up this timeline makes a lot of sense. The other thing that was found in Scott's warehouse was a pair of pliers, and there was a strand of black hair found on these pliers. Of course, this ended up being tested, and it was likely, but not 100% certain that it was Laci's hair. However, forensic scientists also tested these pliers for other details of any human blood or cells or anything, and there was no indication of any other part of a human body on that plier besides just the strand of hair, which a strand of hair, I mean, your hair gets left everywhere. Like, that's not like that insane, but that was the evidence that was enough to get this man arrested and have the death penalty sentenced on him, which is pretty insane. I never realized how little evidence, like physical evidence, there actually was leading towards this, especially when you think of cases like O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony, when there's so many like cases that are so obviously done by the person that they didn't get found guilty for. Like, it's just, it's very confusing to me. But when you consider the media really perpetuating that this case was obviously Scott Peterson had done it, then the jury also felt like that, I don't know, it could be skewed, which is why he might get a retrial. I'm not saying he didn't do it. I will say his behavior was weird as fuck. And not only that, but I think the weirdest piece of evidence, which this was used against him, of course, was that his girlfriend Amber Frey claimed that Scott had come over before the death of his wife, before Christmas. In the month of December, he came over crying and he was like, I have to tell you something. I actually was married, but my wife died a year ago. This is going to be my first Christmas without her. So is that weird that he said that prior to her actually dying? Obviously it's weird, but also I have heard stories of people lying about affairs and saying that they were married but their spouse died even though their spouse was perfectly alive. I don't know. Like, was this guy just a fucking douchebag or is he a murderer? That's the question that we have. But if Scott didn't do it, who could have done it? That is definitely a question that's raised. Obviously, when someone is murdered, the husband is usually the first person that people look at. And again, at first when she was missing, the family actually thought that she had just been abducted and that she was, like, someone was waiting for her to give birth so they could steal their baby or something. But ultimately, obviously, that did not end up being the case. But I do think that there could be other explanations as to what happened. Although I will say this guy's behavior is shady as hell. He sounds like a narcissist loser. So could he have done it? Absolutely. Like 100,000%. But I do think that if he did do it, then the police are definitely missing a lot of evidence here that could have made it more obvious. Or I think he could have hired someone to kill his wife, which is definitely another possibility, because then that would corroborate how he was able to have all of those timestamps and have such like an airtight alibi. It's almost a little too perfect that he had this alibi. I do think it's interesting, but let's talk about some other theories. So some people think that Laci could have actually been abducted by a stranger. I think that there's some people who still believe this just because of the lack of physical evidence directly linking Scott to the crime, that they think that it could have just been a random person. I don't know if I think that that's true. A lot of other people think that it was a part of a satanic cult because the absence of her limbs and head led to theories that her death was a part of a ritualistic killing. However, law enforcement again found no evidence to support this claim, and experts suggest that the damage to her body was just consistent with prolonged exposure to water and marine activity. Other people claim that this could have been a botched burglary situation. Apparently there was a burglary reported near the Petersons' home on the morning of Laci's disappearance, and some theorists suggested that maybe Laci had encountered the burglars, like they went to go burgle her house. She caught them and they abducted her and killed her as a response. Other people think that Scott was framed by someone to look guilty just because of the lack of concrete forensic evidence linking Scott to the crime. That fueled that kind of argument, but that also kind of fuels the argument of maybe he hired someone to do it, which would make a bit of sense as well, because maybe he just wanted to be single. He didn't want to be a dad, and so he killed his wife or had his wife killed by someone. I think this is a pretty common theory. I think most people think that Scott did it. And I also will say that they searched that water like 15 times before they ended up finding her in April. They searched that so many times right after she was missing. And again, they didn't find anything, which a lot of people think is kind of suspicious and think perhaps she was dumped into the river at a later point. But if that were true and she was not in the water from the 24th, from when she was reported missing, that wouldn't really make sense when it comes to Scott being the perpetrator, because he was heavily tracked the whole time. Like after she was found missing, he was very much tracked. Like police had chipped his car, they were literally tracking him, making sure, and just tracking his every move. So if that were true and her body was not in the water on the 24th, then a lot of people would say that maybe Scott actually didn't do it. But again, could he have hired someone to do so? Obviously. Another compelling point that I think a lot of people kind of skip over is the fact that there had been a lot of pregnant women that had gone missing in the same time frame in the same area where Laci went missing. For example, Evelyn Hernandez, a 24-year-old who was 9 months pregnant, was disappeared in May of 2002 in San Francisco, and her torso was discovered in the San Francisco Bay months later. But her unborn child and her 5-year-old son were never located. And there were quite a few different cases of different late-term pregnant women who had just gone missing from this area. And a lot of people wonder if there was a predator that was specifically targeting pregnant women that could have been responsible for Laci's death, or is that just a coincidence? I don't know. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this, because I think regardless, do I think that Scott did it? Probably. Whether he hired someone to do it or he did it himself, and somehow got a pretty airtight alibi. I don't know. I think he did do it, but I still think that there should be a retrial because I don't think that the trial was very fair considering the lack of physical evidence. And I think that they could probably still find more physical evidence that would actually send Scott away for good. I mean, he is sent away for good, but you know what I mean. I don't know. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this and what you think happened, but either way, that is it for today's video. If you guys liked it, please give it a big thumbs up. Like I said, let me know in the comments what you guys think of this case. Do you think Scott is guilty? Do you think something else could have happened? What do you think? But anyway, that is it. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, and subscribe for new videos every week, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!